I'm Vicki Hogarth. Welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is a maritime lawyer and also the founder of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring, right here in St. Andrews. Please welcome Vincent Prager. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, Vincent.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
We often do our interviews at the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum, but I thought it'd be nice to have you here today to get people to know not just the museum, but you, Vincent, a lot better as well.
That could be dangerous.
It could be very dangerous. Your museum is a dedication to both your mother and your grandfather, both famous artists in their own right. For people who haven't been to the museum, tell us a little bit about what's inside. It's the former home of Lady Beaverbrook as well.
Well, it's the former home of Lady Beaverbrook. Before that, she was Lady Dunn, and it was Sir James Dunn who was the second owner of the house, originally built for an American industrialist called Louis Egerton Smoot. I got the house in 1995, which was a few months after Lady Beaverbrook died, and we lived there summertime for a while, but I had a right of first refusal on the house next door, which was where the Beaverbrooks vet and his wife lived. And when Mrs. MacLeod died, I had the possibility of exercising the right of first refusal, which I did. And then I thought, well, I don't really need two houses in St. Andrews. And my mother and my grandfather had always wanted to keep as much of their works together for people to see, rather than selling them, which is what they did for the rest of the stuff. And so I had this idea of opening a museum in Dayspring and then living in the other house, because under New Brunswick law, you can't live in a place that's open to the public. So that's what happened, and we've just actually finished our 12th season.
And for people who don't know who your mother and grandfather were, Eva Prager, a beautiful Canadian, she did a lot of portraits. She also did work for Holt Renfrew. She had an incredible career as an artist in a commercial space as well.
Correct.
And then
yes.
Your grandfather, Joseph Oppenheimer, German. Is it the German Expressionist movement or Impressionist movement?
Yeah, Impressionist movement. He was one of the founders, and it was called the Secession in Berlin, and he actually helped organize the first Berlin Secession, where John Singer Sargent, whom he knew, exhibited as well as he did, and various other people. And so he had a very long and interesting career, as did my mother. And we have about 300 paintings between both of them on show right now. And there'll be more next year, because we're planning on opening up the second floor at the house for the next season, as long as we can get all the different inspectors and marshals of one sort or another online to give the green light to our opening upstairs.
And I imagine too, because especially with your grandfather, Joseph Oppenheimer, his works become part of auctions still to this day and are quite heavily valued. Can you talk a little bit about how you sometimes still do acquire new pieces by your family?
Well, it doesn't happen very often, but once in a while somebody will tell me, oh, one of your grandfather's paintings is coming up for auction somewhere or other. In fact, just yesterday there was an old lithograph that he must have done in the 1890s, which came up at an auction in Mannheim in Germany. And so I got that, and now I have to figure out how to get it here. But on the whole, most of the works at the museum now, and what will be when we open again next season, are things that we still had. And as I said, both my mother and my grandfather were very prolific, and so there's no shortage.
One of my favorite pieces when you're at the museum is to look at a letter from Albert Einstein, as well as a portrait. Can you talk a little bit about the connection of Albert Einstein to your family, and how he is actually a pivotal character when it comes to you even being here today?
Yes, well, my grandparents must have met the Einstein somewhere in the early 1930s in Germany, and my grandfather was asked to do a portrait of him. We have a photo of the portrait, which is on display at the museum, but nobody seems to know where the original is. It's probably somewhere, but I'm not aware of it. My mother was upset that we didn't know where it was, and so at one point she did a copy of that picture based on the photograph, and we have the portrait that she did on display next to the other Einstein things we have on display. We do have two original sketches that my grandfather did of Einstein, which are there. And also, after my mom died, it was interesting, there was a cigar box full of champagne corks, and I was about to throw them out because we were sort of cleaning up her basement, and I saw there was a letter underneath that, so I pulled it out, and it was a letter from Einstein written to my grandfather, which my grandfather then scribbled notes all over. And but the letter was from, I think, the late 1940s, when Einstein was at Princeton, and so that was fun to find that, and that letter is on display. And I always tell people who come to the museum that were it not for Einstein, I wouldn't be here, because when I think it was around 1931 or 32, the Einsteins invited my grandparents for tea at their home, which was in the beautiful forested area on the outskirts of Berlin. And so my grandparents, being my grandparents, said could they bring their two kids, my mother and her brother, and they said yes, and so they all came, and you had to walk through the forest a little bit to get to the house. And the house immediately before the Einstein's house was the house of my father's father, and my mother saw my father and his two brothers playing chamber music on the balcony of that house. So she looked up and my father looked down, and that's where they first met. And that evening they went to the movies in that little area, and my father was there and my mother was there, and they saw each other again, and that evening he told his father that that was the girl he was going to marry. So had that not happened, I might not be here today.
And
or at least not in this form.
I'd love to know the story, Vincent, and I know I've heard it before, but I'd love to hear that story for the viewers at home of how your parents then ended up in Montreal, and how your life ended up in Montreal and then eventually here in St. Andrews.
Well, in 1933, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, my grandparents decided that things were not so good in Germany. My grandfather was already living in England in the 1890s, and he had a studio there on the King's Road in Chelsea. And my grandparents spent a part of every year in England, and they had relatives there and lots of friends. And my grandfather did a lot of his commissions in England. And so in 1933, I think it was around April or May, they decided, okay, that's enough, we're out. And so they left, and they packed up all the stuff, and we were very fortunate that they got all the furniture. It was all shipped to London, and they then sailed to London and with my mother, and set up their home there. My father was already living in London from the late 1920s, I believe, running the affairs of the company that his father had, and so while they met in Berlin, they actually got married in 1934 in London. And in fact, the day after tomorrow will be their 90th wedding anniversary. They got married on the 16th of October, 1934. And anyway, so they lived in England, and I was born in England. And my mother and my uncle never really got along all that well, and my uncle was tried to be very much involved in the family and telling everybody what to do. And so by the time 1949 came around, they'd had enough of that. And I think that was one of the principal reasons that they decided to move to Canada. My father's business took him to North America several times a year before that, and so they were familiar with Canada and the United States. They preferred Canada. And my mother went a couple of times as well before we actually moved with my father. And so on July 19th, 1949, we set sail for Montreal on the Empress of Canada and arrived a week later. And people always find it strange when I tell them that from the day I arrived on the 26th of July, 1949 until today, I've never lived more than a mile away from where I live right now. Montreal's a very sort of ghettoized city. I've lived in 4 or 5 different places, but always in the same general area. And you asked me about how I came to St. Andrews. I went to McGill University, and one of my friends was one of Lord Beaverbrook's grandchildren. And Beaverbrook had set up a foundation both in the UK and in Canada, and the Canadian one had some problems with the people who were running it then, and the Aiken family asked Tim to sort of take it over and try to get it back on its feet, and he needed a Canadian director, so he asked me if I would be one of the directors, and I can't remember exactly what year it was, but it must be getting on for 40 years ago now, so it's been a long time. And with the directorship on the foundation, I also was nominated to be a governor of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, and so I would come down frequently for board meetings of the gallery. And in 1995, I think it was in June, beginning of June, somewhere around there, there was a board meeting, and it happened to be on a Sunday, and the meeting was very quick, and it was over, and my flight back wasn't until the evening, and the lady who was the chairman of the board of the gallery, Judy Budovich, she said, you come down often enough, you really ought to own something in New Brunswick. And in the back of my mind was concern because it was the year of the Quebec referendum. And so I thought, well, what do I do if the referendum goes the wrong way? So that, coupled with what Judy mentioned, got me a little bit intrigued. And she said, I have a friend who's and I can't remember what this chap's name was, but he was a member, he was in the cabinet in the government, and he was getting divorced, and they were building an A-frame house somewhere just outside St. Andrews. And so Judy said, you should go and see this house. It's not finished. You can probably get it, then you can restructure it the way you want, and I'll phone and make an appointment. So I had the day to myself, basically. So she made the appointment. I drove down. I met this chap at the entrance to the old golf course. And so we went off to see this house, which was one of these places where everything was wrong. At least in my mind, it was badly situated. There was no view. Everything was wrong with this place. So I said, "Thank you very much," and he drove me back to where I'd parked the car. And I said, "Well, I still have some time. I'd like to see St. Andrews because I'd never been to St. Andrews before." And so he said, "Well, you go here, you go there, and it's down there." But I said, "Don't you want to see Dayspring?" And as a director of the foundation, I knew a little bit about Lady Beaverbrook's affair, so I knew a little bit about Dayspring. So I said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" And she had died the year before, and it had just been put up for sale a few weeks earlier. So we drove up, and there was this big, I was going to say gate, but it was all in wood. You couldn't see through because they built a 10-foot fence around the whole property. There was no doorbell. There was a tiny little door next to the driveway, but everything was covered over, so you couldn't really see the house or anything. So we rattled the door, nothing happened, and I was just literally about to get into the car when the door opened, and I guess one of the gardeners or somebody showed up, and so this chap said, "Well, this is Vincent Prager, and he's on the board of the foundation, and he'd like to see Dayspring." And there was a big sign outside saying it was for sale, but that they were only going to show it to people who had a bank reference letter. But this guy explained to whoever it was who opened the door that I was part of the foundation and maybe they could make an exception. So the door closed again, and then the famous Dr. McLeod, who was the vet who looked after all Lady Beaverbrook's dogs, he showed up. And so then I was allowed in, and so I was walking around this incredible place. And I remember I was on the solarium out on the rear side of the house, and I thought, this is incredible, it's amazing. How much are they asking for this place? And I thought it was millions. And then he told me, and I couldn't believe it, because Montreal prices were very, very low because of the referendum, but this was even more ridiculous. So I said thank you, and I had the rest of the tour, and then I had to leave to go back to the airport, so I never saw St. Andrews. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, I've got to get this out of my system now. And so I called the gentleman who was the executive of Lady Beaverbrook's estate, and I said, well, can you just send me the listing? I'd like to know about it. And what is the price? And so the price was right. And so then, so the meeting had been on the Sunday, I think it was. So I called him on the Monday. He sent me there was a video, even a VHS of the house and the listing, and I looked at that, and then I called him back. I guess it was on the Wednesday or the Thursday, and I said, I really can't imagine that I would want this, but I've got to get it out of my system. I can't come down this coming weekend because there was a big party in Montreal that I had friends coming to, and I said I can't come this weekend, but I could come the following weekend when I was driving down to Rockport, Massachusetts, which is where we used to spend summers. And he said, and I said, could you sort of maybe put it on hold because of my connection with the foundation? He said, no, we can't do that, but I'm sure it's not going to sell. It's only just been put on the market, so don't worry about it. So then I did worry about it. And so I called him back the next day, and I said, well, I can't come on Saturday, but I could come on the Sunday for the day. And so he organized that. So I flew down early in the morning on the Sunday, drove back out, looked at the house again, spent all day there, again left with urgently to get back to the airport and with insufficient time to see St. Andrews. So I had not seen St. Andrews at all other than just the drive in. And I made an offer on the Monday. It was accepted on the Tuesday, and they got a higher offer on the Wednesday. So I was very fortunate that my instinct of not waiting another week prevailed, and so that's how I ended up getting the place. And there were two garages, and I collect classic and antique cars, and so I wanted the garages, but that was not possible because Dr. McLeod, who was the vet, he wanted to keep his car and his tractor in there. So, but they gave me a right of first refusal on the garages, and they said, well, you might as well have it on the house as well. So that's how this whole thing developed.
Wow. And that's, you have you own now the house next door to where the vet lived, which is because Lady Beaverbrook had, is it 7 or 8 Chihuahuas? She had quite a life.
She had up to a dozen at some point. But the house where I live is actually the last house designed by the Maxwell brothers. Dayspring itself was designed by a different architect in Montreal, but.
And I know you do close the museum for the winter, but anyone
yes.
who's watching this interview in the off season when we're recording it will have so much to look forward to next year when you open the upstairs, which I've had the chance to preview.
In between, we always say we're open by appointment. So
yes.
If we can, if somebody like yesterday, I was sitting there while I was down here, and all of a sudden a car pulled up, and so I said, okay, you can come on in. So there was this very nice lady and her daughter from Maine who came, and so they had a tour around, and so we do that if it's possible. It isn't always possible to find someone to open up the museum, but where it is possible, we do that.
And for instance, the Prime Minister was here, I think it was just last year, for a caucus meeting, and made an appointment
yes.
to see a painting that your mother had done of him when he was.
Well, when he came, he didn't know what was there, but we have a whole Trudeau wall. And he came. He spent about 45 minutes. That was the only non-governmental work that they did during the caucus meeting, the cabinet meeting.
So tell us a little bit too, for people who don't know the other side of your life, that you're a maritime lawyer, which obviously I'm sure the Port of Montreal keeps you quite busy. But a connection to the East Coast makes sense as well for the kind of work you do. But what does it entail? I know there's not that many people in Canada who do the line of work that you do in law.
There are very few. There are probably not even 2 dozen, or probably less even, that do this full time. But I've been doing this since 1968 when I passed my bar exams. But much of what I do has nothing to do with Canada at all, because you get called to do things by people who are elsewhere as well. And maritime law is a body of law just dealing with things to do with ships, but it's basically like every law for normal people, but just designed specifically for shipping. And it's very much the same all over the world. There are lots of different treaties and conventions and things. And so if you talk to a maritime lawyer in I don't know, Japan or in Bulgaria or wherever, United States even, the principles are much the same, the laws are much the same. There'll be little individual variations, but it's very similar all over the world, and that makes it interesting that you can communicate with people everywhere. One of the people I know who's a really amazing guy is in Odessa, or he was in Odessa, and he got elected to the Ukrainian parliament at the same time as Zelensky. And then about a year and a half ago, he was named by Zelensky as the chief war crimes prosecutor for the Ukrainians. And we still communicate. I send him messages. He answers them fairly promptly. And it's amazing. They've got over 100,000 war crime investigations going on just for the war in Ukraine.
Wow. So I don't think, Vincent, I've met anyone more well-traveled than you, especially with your job. But then that always makes me wonder, what is it about St. Andrews that you love so much? For a person who's been around the world and continues to travel, what draws you back to being here and making this your other home?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it's probably number one is the people here. I've made an awful lot of really, really lovely friends, including you. The location, the house itself is beautiful, the views, the water, the lifestyle.
And you continue
It's beautiful.
You continue to serve as well on the Beaverbrook Foundation, which does
the Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation.
The Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation, which does a lot of incredible work, including recently for Swallowtail Lighthouse on Grand Manan. That was one of a big donation you made last year.
Yes, and we do an awful lot for UNB. We also are, the St. John Regional Hospital Foundation have a radiothon every year, and we do a matching donation, I think up to $100,000 or something like that for that, which seems to work very well. We created a scholarship recently at UNB in the name of Lady Violet Aiken, who was married to Max Aiken, who was Beaverbrook's son. And lots of sort of little things in New Brunswick that we feel should be supported, at least for a little while. Each of the directors has a little fund that we can use every year to assist in some of the programs. We did something with Sunbury Shores, and so where there's something that we think is really important, we'll try to do something.
Oh, and in the name of your museum, as we look forward to the 2025 season, what can we expect on the second floor? Tell us a little bit about what we will see when the museum opens full-time in the summer of next year.
Well, there are 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 5 more bedrooms up there, which will be turned into exhibition space. There's a long passageway. There are 2 gigantic rooms, one of which was a library and one of which was a ballroom, where they showed first-run movies in the day. We're going to be using most of that space for archival work, but the smaller rooms will be open, and there'll be more paintings and more mementos and personal parts of the life of the family that I come from.
Mm-hmm. It's a
we
museum.
look forward to welcoming everybody.
It's a museum. Whenever I have visitors, I make sure they go, because it's an experience not just for art lovers. It's an experience of St. Andrews, and it's an experience of Lady Beaverbrook. I can't sing the praises highly enough, because it is just such a special, experiential thing to do when you're in St. Andrews. How would you explain the museum from your final thoughts of today's show to someone who's never been before?
Well, I can start sort of negatively by saying that in the 12 years that we've been operational, we always ask people, if we can, that they should like us on TripAdvisor, and we've had a lot of positive feedback on that. And in all those 12 years, we've only had one negative comment, and that was from some lady who said the parking was hard, which it isn't. And I've never quite figured that one out, but somebody always has to be number one. But you know, the house is part of the museum, the experience, the atmosphere, and the pictures themselves are unique, and we're happy to welcome people, which we do, from all over the world. Last year we even had somebody from Mongolia, and so that was fun. So it's a great experience, and I enjoy it, as I hope, as much as the people who come to visit.
And one of the most incredible views of Minister's Island as well, right?
True,
From the
yes,
back.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come in today, and I look forward to sitting down with you again soon.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
My guest today has been Vincent Prager, founder of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring, right here in St. Andrews by the Sea. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.